Okay, good morning everyone. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm here with Jess Mega, who's probably got the best job in the world, and we're going to talk to you about tech-enabled healthcare, making the promise a reality. I think when we've spoken about this for the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk about how technology is embedding itself into healthcare in every part of everyone's life, and is turning the healthcare system upside down. There's been a huge amount of progress since then, and I think we're going to share with you some of the insights, but we think that right now is the most exciting time to be in medicine. Before I hand over to Jess, who's really going to walk you through what VERILY is doing, which is state of the art, I want to give you a bit of a background on why technology is making such inroads into healthcare. First of all, we know that drug treatment alone is not enough. Drug responses are anything from 40 to 60 to 70% if you're lucky, but there are a huge amount of factors such as environmental, behavioral, financial, emotional that actually also impact the outcomes that are not amenable to the drug alone. And actually the placebo effect is being turned by some companies actually into a digital therapeutic. So actually there's a lot still to be done about how do you amplify patient outcomes and get to a much more precision-based medicine based on technology. The other thing we know is healthcare systems are struggling to control costs. So if you just take the United States, we spend about $10,000 per patient per year, compared to half of that in other developed countries in Europe, for example. But still, all healthcare systems are struggling with costs. And this has given rise to kind of looking for new ways to take costs out of the system, giving patients back some of the power and actually enabling doctors to be more effective. And that's fueling this whole digital technology embedment into health. The third thing is really important, that actually finally patients are able to increasingly take charge of health. And if you look at the United States alone, there were two rules passed last year, the ONC rule and the CMS rule, which means that insurance companies as well as CMS has to give back electronic data to patients. But patients don't know what to do with this data. So many digital companies, third parties are looking at this as an opportunity to make it digestible, to make it actionable, and to put the power back into the patient's hands. And that fundamentally is going to actually turn the healthcare system upside down. We also know, importantly, and you're going to hear much more from VERILY, about how technology is accelerating at an unprecedented pace. And the investment in healthcare technologies was $8.1 billion last year. It's going to get to $16 billion in 2021. And it's just incredible how technology is ingraining in every part of the patient journey. And regulators and payers are also adopting a kind of a liberal approach to actually enable this to go forward. So I think we really are at a juxtaposition where this is all changing very quickly. Just one quick slide just to illustrate the fact that there are so many healthcare companies entering the entire patient journey, from preventing disease to right through to managing and the complicated diseases. So this is a vibrant ecosystem. So at Sanofi, this is the way we look at technology-enabled healthcare. We look at it in 4 dimensions. We create drugs. So our first question is, can we enable our drugs to be more effective with technology? And we call that digital therapeutics, or can we apply services around some of our drugs specific to the disease and make it much more precise? Then we are also now starting to explore whether we can have standalone digital therapeutics. That's a really exciting area. No time to talk about it today. You'll hear some more about it tomorrow from one of our panels. But the most disruptive, I think, is can we manage populations leveraging telehealth, leveraging technology, where patients no longer need to manage their chronic diseases at home, but can be fully managed by actually having them stay in a virtual clinic setup, and can this truly take costs out of the system? And I think that this is the most disruptive dimension, and the potential of virtual clinics is here. And I'm going to now hand over to my co-partner, Jess, to talk to you about what they're doing with VERILY. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. And thank you all for being part of us and part of this discussion. As Ameet mentioned, we are sitting at an amazing moment at the convergence of technology and healthcare. And one thing that has been particularly interesting for us at VERILY is we grew out of a technology company. We grew out of Google and Google X. And our mission is to think about exactly what we started to talk today. How do you take health information and actually have people live happier lives? And the thing that is very real in healthcare is there are two major gaps. One is there's a gap in information, and there's also a gap in the decisions that we see patients making. So on the information side, what I'm showing you is what we may see for glucose. So for example, even the most adherent patients may check their blood glucose 4 times a day. But the reality is that biology is happening all of the time. As each of you are sitting there, your glucose is going up and down based on whether you went to the food court yet or not. You all have different levels. And it's very important to understand that. The second thing is there is a decision gap. We know that as doctors, people may see us once a year, twice a year, but people are making health decisions every week, every day, and every hour. And so how do we start to close this gap? And in particular, we'd like to talk today about diabetes. We know that diabetes is one of the leading causes of blindness, kidney failure, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and limb amputation. These are critically important conditions that we want to get ahead of. And at VERILY, what we are doing is thinking about new ways to collect information. The example I'll give you today is a digital tool, but we're also thinking about different molecular tools. Then how do you create these virtual clinics? It's something that, along with Sanofi, we're working on, and I'll introduce you to that concept. And then importantly, how do you activate health information using AI? On the collection front, as I mentioned, biology is happening all of the time. And along with Dexcom, we're working on the world's smallest continuous glucose monitor. What does that mean for patients? What does it mean for doctors? It means a glucose monitor that's smaller, that's lower cost, that can be democratized, that's disposable, waterproof, and also tracks activity. Traditionally, continuous glucose monitors have been used for patients with type 1 diabetes, but there's a growing epidemic of patients with type 2 diabetes, and devices like this will be applicable. We then want to take that information, this information that an individual is experiencing, and provide guidance. We know that it's okay to see someone in clinic and I might give 10 different recommendations, but going back to this idea that people are making health decisions all of the time, how do we pair people with guidance and care leads? How do we think about cause and effect? And how do we give people direct access to care, especially as we're starting to see that the medications could really be optimized? Now, I want to highlight one very important point around this Onduo program, and that is that cause and effect is conveyed. So I might give someone a recommendation to eat a low carbohydrate diet, but we're starting to see that just because I metabolize a bagel one way, Ameet might have a very different response. And so if we compare an individual's response to a meal or to an activity, you truly get to the world of precision medicine. And again, this is all being done outside of the 4 walls of a clinic. So finally, as we close out this part of the section, I did want to talk about getting ahead of the problem. Thus far, I've been talking about new ways of collecting information, new ways of harnessing it for patients and doctors, but how do we actually get ahead and prevent some of the diseases that we're seeing? And one of them gets to this point about diabetic retinopathy. I mentioned that diabetes is one of the leading causes of blindness. And what we've started to think about is, could we use the same technologies that you're seeing all around the convention today, where we're taking images, maybe it's images, I saw one of the images where it was sorting cats and dogs. What if we took that same image recognition but applied it to healthcare? And what I'm showing you is images of the fundus. On the left-hand side of the slide, there's no diabetic retinopathy. On the right-hand side of the slide, there's proliferative diabetic retinopathy. Now, the interesting thing is when you get humans to read these slides, we don't agree with ourselves that frequently. So to give you the fact, if you and I were ophthalmologists and we were reading the slides, we would agree with each other. Just think to yourself, we agree with each other 60% of the time. The fascinating thing is if I check myself over time, I only agree with myself 65% of the time. So this is where AI can come in, and we've been trying to think about using image recognition to help with diabetic retinopathy screening. And importantly, we now have published this work in JAMA looking at deep learning algorithms that show very high sensitivity and specificity for diagnosing diabetic retinopathy. So it's important to try to think about how do you take this next generation of research, this next generation of technology, and now scale it into care. And we're very excited to say that we have a program launching now in India with a CE mark Class 2 device, really thinking about this end-to-end solution for patients who are being screened for diabetic retinopathy. But I think we are just at the very beginning of this convergence of technology in healthcare. And it's going to take many different types of people. It will take doctors, it will take data scientists, it will take individual volunteers and participants. But this is an incredibly exciting time, and we're happy to be here and talking more about it.
Thank you very much, Jess. And you're just getting a glimpse that this is no longer just fiction. This is actually here at scale. There are how many thousand patients in Ondua right now?
So we're now passing, we started, just so people know, we intentionally started with populations that are in the southeast part of the United States, and we're now in the many thousands of patients who have signed up to help get managed outside of the four walls of a clinic.
So just to kind of wrap this session up, and also I'm not sure if we're enabled, but I think we probably have time for some Q&A. But this is not just about taking virtual healthcare into high-cost health systems in the developed world. So yes, we're currently doing this for diabetes, and we hope to expand that into multi-morbid disease for the United States, for many parts of the developing world. But if you can get a chance while you're here, go and visit the Africa Tech stand. If you look at Africa, today it has about 15% of the world's population. We also have very few doctors in Africa that can truly manage the diseases at a distance. So the actual specialists are very remote. So just imagine now the telehealth applications that we have embedded into a virtual healthcare provision, being able to enable specialists to manage remote areas with their smartphones, with telehealth, with technologies that they can have which are miniaturized, robust, and cheap to actually manage health at a distance. So we really think that we are now at a cusp point that we can offer the opportunity to address major diseases, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, respiratory disease in many parts of the world in a very democratized way, and raise the overall standard of care, as well as take costs out of very expensive healthcare systems. So with that, I'm going to just wrap up our session and just say, Jess, do you really think this is a reality? I mean, how long do you think it's going to take us to actually prove that this is fundamentally going to shift healthcare in the next, and over what time frame and which diseases?
So it is absolutely a reality, but the piece that Ameet points out that's so important, we need to get the evidence to know that these interventions are both safe and effective for patients. And if we do that, it will be no different than any other technology. I'm a cardiologist, so I like to talk about the idea that 200 years ago, the stethoscope was considered a new technology. Over time, we have cardiac imaging, ultrasounds, MRIs. The reason we use these is because it provides value and it helps improve outcomes for people. And the same is going to be absolutely true for digital tools. In fact, I bet 5 to 10 years from now, we won't even use the word digital in front of a certain tool. It will just be another option to help us manage patients and to help patients themselves manage their own conditions.
So with that, I'd like to just draw this actual presentation to a close. We're actually finished early, so if you wanted to, if there are questions from the audience, we'd love to actually engage with you. This is not meant to be a didactic presentation, so are there any questions from the audience to either Jess or myself? There's a question in the front. We probably can't hear you, so I will hand you the... is there a microphone? No, give the microphone.
Thank you. So I'm working at Sanofi in the oncology department, and I was wondering whether the kind of efforts that you have now started for diabetes and for cardiovascular, whether there is any intention to extend them, for example, to the immune oncology field. Is there anything ongoing already?
So thank you for the question. Jess, you want to try?
Sure. So the question is, can you extend these tools to many other conditions? And it would be a real blind spot if organizations like ours and like Sanofi weren't looking at conditions like oncology. There are many interesting efforts. One is around really phenotyping oncology even further. So certainly at VERILY, we have a program working on deep immune profiling. The reason that ends up being something that's in our sweet spot is there's a huge amount of data, terabytes of data when you start to look deeply at the immune system. The other thing is, how do you use digital tools? So for example, could you connect the care that someone has at home with the care you have in clinic? And certainly among patients being treated with chemotherapy, we worry about fever and neutropenia. And so there are ways to start to connect that same ecosystem. The reason we started with diabetes is that it's a little bit, for any diabetologists in the room, I apologize, but it's a little bit more straightforward in terms of the signals we're integrating in the care, but we will absolutely be extending these to patients more holistically.
And I think oncology is a perfect example of where virtual healthcare can fundamentally shift patients' experience. So if you think about that, you know, if you've got cancer, you're being treated at home. If you can be treated at home, you can be in your own environment, where your other elements of, beside the biology, can be looked after, the welfare, the experience you have, the emotional support can be delivered. And actually it's in a different environment, so you're not having the burden of having to go back and forth to specialty centers. But importantly, your response can be monitored. You take multiple treatments, we can understand how to be more precise in the biological delivery of what's working, what's not. We can measure your side effects in different ways. And that can all be done through wearable technologies or miniaturized technologies at home. But you also get with that the coaching, the life support, and the ecosystem can be built. You can imagine how a virtual system, which is intelligent, which also has physicians built into it, can actually change the way oncology is managed overall. So I think with there, we're just testing the technologies, and now we just need to take it the next step. Okay? We got time for another question, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. In your opinion, what's the biggest hurdle preventing from making the promise to a reality in the tech-enabled healthcare sector?
The biggest hurdle. I'm going to pass it on to Jess. She's much smarter than I am.
And I wanted to make sure this was the biggest hurdle internationally or locally? Internationally. So I'll give you a very tangible example. The work that I was showing around diabetic retinopathy screening, we are very proud that there's a scientifically rigorous paper looking at the algorithm. But just because you have a phenomenal algorithm, how do you actually deploy these tools in an end-to-end fashion? And that's where it's very different if you're doing it in different geographies. So by design, the reason we have programs that are going on in India in addition to programs that are now going on in the United States and scaling is that understanding the healthcare system and what actually works on the ground is different. So I think the biggest thing to remember is that you can have the technologies, but you have to understand the local health systems in order to truly get traction. So it's such an important point, and it's something that we're thinking about a lot, and it sounds like you are as well.
So just from my side, one of the things that we see, so the biggest things that we are looking at right now is, number one, how can you create the evidence in many, many diseases? But also with that is the trust, because this fundamentally shifts the responsibility of the physicians, the primary care physicians, and you're turning the system on its head, okay? So you're putting a lot of the emphasis back to the primary care doctor. You have specialists managing remotely. There's less, I'd say, clinical work, which is hands-on, much more dependency on devices. You have to trust those devices. So there's a lot of effort just to register the devices. And then you get to this point. where if you're using artificial intelligence on an algorithm, can you trust it? Is it customized to me? Is there bias within the data? What if something goes wrong? So it's the same issue as autonomous cars. Is at what point do we feel so comfortable to rely on the black box that's helping to augment the decisions? So at the moment, this is more like a telehealth with intelligence. But as you get more sophisticated, the reliance on the output and the trust you have, plus the privacy issues that come with it, these are all major hurdles. Okay, and so it's not simple. But if there's a commitment from the healthcare system, we think we can make this transformation. We've got 2 minutes, so probably time for one more question, if there's one. I see one in the middle back. Gentleman, he's standing up. There we are.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation. My question is, prescription medicine and over-the-counter data. I mean, if you have data flowing in from prescription medicine and over-the-counter medicine, from unique patients, what's the relevance to, this health tech, future of the health tech that you're talking about?
So I didn't quite catch the last part of the question. You're talking about over-the-counter medicines and prescription medicines and how we can integrate that data. Is that?
Yes. So if you have data from unique customers that are buying over-the-counter and prescription medicine, what's the integration into this tech?
Yeah. So I'll start the question, and I'd love to get a response from Jess. We think it's essential. So one of the things that we are looking at, and many of our organizations, is looking at what are the medicines people are using, and how does that impact their well-being, their outcomes, and what is the interaction between all of these medicines together? And it's not just the prescription medicines; it's also the over-the-counter medicines that you use as well. So this is a burgeoning field, and we think we need to get the more information we have on the totality of what people are doing and the density of the data in their daily lives, including the medicines, including the over-the-counter medicines, the better we can understand how best to serve the outcomes. But just turning the question around, we can also help patients to predict when they need over-the-counter medicines. So, for example, we're doing some experiments in allergy. Imagine that you could predict when the pollen count is going to go up in your particular area, and you get a reminder to make sure that you take your prophylactic antihistamines, which are custom to you, and you can actually record how you feel, and it'll learn about the next time you do it. It'll also even predict the type of pollen that you need. So these all things can be geo-mapped to you to make it useful, and it can also be directed to where to avoid or where to go. So I think the world is going to change, and knowing the medical history and the medicines history is essential to that as well. Jess, do you have a...
Yeah, so I will close it out with 3 rapid thoughts on that. One is adherence in general. We know that in about 50% of the cases, patients aren't taking the medicines. So are there ways to wrap around services? The second one is we have seen in our virtual clinics that people are not always on the right medicine, so optimizing those therapies. And then the final one goes back to tailoring it to your individual response. We have to remember that even if you look at studies that are in the New England Journal of Medicine, they're giving you the aggregate response. But what does it mean for you as an individual? And that is where the world of digital tools and medicine really have, I think, the potential for huge impact.
So thank you, everyone. We've run out of time, and look forward. Please enjoy the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.